Thank you very much. Although I will indeed try to introduce some material from my book, I will mostly devote my presentation to questions of human rights and how they affect the Israeli policies, simply because I always consider that with all my passion for various kinds of scholarship, that human rights and alleviating human suffering have to come first. The general subject of my presentation will indeed have to do with fundamentalists, but not what a fundamentalist group, in this case Jewish, is doing by itself, but how fundamentalistic thinking and theories are affecting the practices, the theories and practices of the State of Israel and the territories. Of course, in Israel too, but I will omit that from the consideration for this time. And how actually this ideology, which is strictly followed by the secular state for various reasons, is making the peace process, the Oslo-Cairo peace process, which is actually very profitable to Israel, and which is everything that Noam Chomsky has said it is, into by now something very unrealistic, meaning that there are, if a state is enslaved more to ideology than to profit, it cannot serve profit. You know, there is that great saying, you cannot serve God and Mammon. Maybe instead of God we should substitute other things in this connection, but certainly you cannot serve racist ideology, as I will immediately show, and conduct realistic policies in, let us say, which will bring investors to the area. I will begin with problem of land. First of all, as it came to exist after 27 years of occupation, and as it continued after Oslo, meaning in the last 14 months. At the time that Oslo agreements were signed, September 1993, about 70% of the West Bank and about 30% of the Gaza Strip came into possession, into ownership of the State of Israel. I will not discuss here for lack of time how they came into possession of State of Israel, just as I will not discuss how much of the most of federal land in the United States became federal land. The most important thing for me is to say that officially, not socially, but officially, land which belongs to State of Israel is used only for benefit of Jews. Let me get it very accurate. When you read in your media about Israeli settlements, this is not correct. They are not intended for all Israeli citizens, of whom 17% are Palestinians actually. Let me add at this point that there are Israeli Palestinians who serve in the army, in fact in increasing numbers. There are Israeli Palestinians who, let us say, reached in the army the rank of colonel. Some of them were even governors, or usually deputy governors, of West Bank and Gaza Strip district. But the important point is that an Israeli colonel who is not Jewish cannot benefit from 70% of the area of West Bank and from the 30% area of the Gaza Strip. But the important fact, of course, is not the Israeli colonel. This is illustration. Important fact is that the first thing, in my opinion, that you should know about Palestinians and their feelings in the territories and also out of the territories, because the land is also denied to Palestinians in diaspora, that a Palestinian from the West Bank see 70% of the land, of his land, on which is not only confiscated from him, but on which he cannot do anything. He cannot rent it, he cannot either apartment or a piece, he cannot do with it everything, while the land is open to officially and legally to all the Jews. Before going to the implication of the word all the Jews in this respect, let me give you some additional figure, or additional set of figures. You know, being natural scientist, I cannot escape from feeding people with numbers. I said right now that 30% of the Gaza Strip, the 30% which was left under Israeli ownership, all belongs to the state of Israel. The number of the people on that 30% is 6,000. The number of the people of the remaining 70% is 800,000. This by itself I call apartheid. The situation in Gaza Strip before, and of course in the West Bank too, before Oslo and after Oslo is a situation of apartheid. I could add many other details that majority of Gazan water is given to the 6,000 settlers on the 30% of the area, that there is a nice pleasure lake in one of those areas, while water in the rest of Gaza Strip is nearly bring harms to health. It is on the border of bringing harm to health. But I will go to something much more significant in the West Bank. If you take those 70% of land denied to Palestinians and ask yourself what is happening to them, then the answer will be that 16% has been given to the settlers, to the Jewish settlers. Again, I emphasize Jewish settlers, not Israeli settlers. But 54% of the land stands empty. It was not distributed, it was confiscated, it stands empty. I can flatter myself that for many, very many years I formed very many friendships among Palestinians of the West Bank and many others. And I would say, and my opinion is supported by many other Israeli Jews, not necessarily those of my opinion, that had the Israeli government, after Oslo, taken those 54%, more than half, empty lands of the West Bank, empty, I mean emptied, of course they were not empty before, or let us now take plainly, half of the area of the West Bank which was robbed of its rightful Palestinian owners, but it was not given to anyone else. And giving it back to the Palestinian farmers, the Oslo process could be pushed for quite a number of years. With all its consequences, I am now not entering the consequences. I fully agree with Noam Chomsky about the consequences, but, and I know also that Israeli government considers that the Oslo process is very much for benefit, but the ideology of not giving back the land, which, as I point in my book, was already redeemed meaning being given to Jews as possession of the Jewish state, giving it back to non-Jews, in this case Palestinians, and causing the land therefore to become unredeemed again, was more important than every political consideration, let us say, that every counting of profits. Let me say something about Palestinian side in this business. Palestinians everywhere, but especially in the West Bank, are using an Arabic word, sumut. Sumut means attachment. By this they are expressing, I think very justly, in a slogan, their attachment to the land. Because if you look through the years what has happened to the Palestinians in Palestine, you see that they have been driven east. And what they desire, in my view, of course, which can be disputed or contested, but in my view, based on my very many Palestinian friends, is that the process will not only stop, but to at least to symbolic or extensive sense reversed, meaning that after a process in which always Palestinian lands were being taken over and never returned, even in, if some of you know about the Israeli village Baram and Ikrit, I am mentioning you that those, just in passing, that a Maronite village in Israel called Baram, whose actually people of whose in part helped Israel invade Lebanon because they are Maronites, still they have its land not returned against all precedent and all benefit. If therefore those empty lands, contrary to existing settlements in which, as let's say half realist, I admit, there would have been what is called trouble, opposition, demonstration, and so on. There is always trouble in carrying justice when the robber already has something in his possession. But I am emphasizing here something which would not have carried trouble except ideological trouble. And this didn't happen. The second point, meaning that the apartheid ideology, as I am calling it for more than 20 years, is more important than other considerations, and it is this ideology, application of this ideology, of course, much more visible to Palestinians there than to people here, quite in addition, of course, to the deceptions of American media, which more and more convinced by now, ended by convincing Palestinian people that peace process is not peace for them, not for any farmer, not for any poor man, maybe for some rich people, but for nobody else besides. Let me take another point, water. I am afraid that Israelis and Palestine are not similar in their climate to Massachusetts. They are more similar to Arizona and New Mexico, meaning that water is the crucial factor in agriculture and development of agriculture. The very first thing that Israel did in the territories in September '67 was to impose a regulation, or two regulations really, one prohibiting Palestinians to drill or dig wells on their own private property. Let me get it clear, on the 30% of West Bank which still belongs to Palestinians, they are forbidden totally and completely to dig wells from September '67. And in the existing wells, whose capacity was measured at the time, they are prohibited to install new pumps with greater capacity. Of course, the settlers are not prohibited to do this, with the result that, according to my last data, which are admittedly about 4 years old, the 130,000 settlers on the West Bank are used more water for agriculture than 1.5 million of Palestinians. First of all, I call it apartheid again. Secondly, I will tell you that if after Oslo, Israeli government would give 1,000, let us say, chosen Palestinian farmers permits to dig 1,000 wells. Let us say chosen by their, let's say, by their willingness to support peace process. But 1,000 Palestinian farmers. This would have be of enormous effect not only of those 1,000 farmers, but let us say on their cousins and second cousins, practically on all the farmers, because just in the case of land, and especially empty land, this would have shown that the process of not allowing development for one side and allowing it on other would be reversed. Now, apart, you can imagine there are very many other discriminations, or shall I say manifestation of apartheid in the territories. But therefore I will limit myself and speak about one more before going more deeply to analyzing the situation in general terms of apartheid and its roots in its ideological roots, meaning from where this ideology arose, at least in my view. The additional factor that I want to discuss is so-called rule of law. First of all, contrary to most of the states of the world, whatever they are otherwise, and contrary to the state of Israel itself, the system of law in West Bank and Gaza Strip is not territorial. What it means, it is not territorial. Let us take the so-called state of Panama. I am not now discussing how it serves the United States interest. I think I am agreed with it with Noam Chomsky. But I would want to point to you a fact which is different in Panama and in the territories. Let us say an American tourist goes to Panama City and commits a traffic offense. Let us say he is driving wildly or drunkenly. Of course, the Panama police will arrest him. Of course, he will be put before Panaman court. And I think that the United States in such cases will not protest. At least it didn't protest now. But in territories, there is no territorial law, therefore, like in Panama or even like Grenada. Israeli Jews, especially settlers, but all Israeli Jews, if they will commit an offense in the territories, including traffic offense, will be brought to Israel and will be judged within Israel by Israeli civilian courts. Not, by the way, by the Israeli military courts, which are judging Palestinians for any offense. Meaning that even though the courts in territories are Israeli and military, in order to show the superiority of one group over another, the Israeli military courts in territories have till this very day not judge a single Israeli. They judge soldiers, of course, but not single Israeli civilian. Let us go a little more. Israel had, until beginning of Intifada, until, let us say, spring '88, a Palestinian force acting under its orders and composed of Palestinian policemen. In the beginning of Intifada, those policemen were compelled by pressure to resign. The force therefore existed, let's say, more than 20 years. During all that time, it was prohibited to detain Israeli Jew and especially settler. It could, let us say, if seeing a car speeding or something, stop it, because nobody can be sure who is the driver, who is in the car. It could ask for identification card. On seeing the words Israeli and then Jew, the only thing that Palestinian policemen could say was that please wait until I call Israeli army or Jewish police, or if not, he could only write the number. The same thing was written into Cairo II agreement, which means that if Israeli Jew visits, as he can visit all the time, the autonomous Gaza Strip, let me say in passing that Palestinians who want to go out from Gaza to Israel need both Palestinian and Israeli permission. But Israelis who enter autonomous Gaza Strip need only Israeli permission. Once they get it, Palestinians have to admit them. So let us say such an Israeli Jew is admitted and he commits a traffic offense in the Gaza Strip. By text of Cairo agreement, the same racist thing, which doesn't exist in Panama or other places, Palestinian police that you hear so much about in New York Times, but of course not about this, We have no power to detain an Israeli Jew simply because he's an Israeli Jew. Let us go even more further on this law enforcement. This has even appeared in in American media that Israel refuses to free certain categories of prisoners. However, the exact quotations, as they appear in the Hebrew media, or even in Jerusalem Post, and of course on Israeli TV and radio, have by everyone from Rabin down, have not been given in the United States. The official Israeli policy is that Israel will free prisoners who have Arab blood on their hands and will refuse to free prisoners who have Jewish blood on their hands. The Arab blood and Jewish blood are quotation from all possible Israeli sources, as I say, from Rabin down. Blood being meaning not only killing in this respect, but also wounding. Again, let me first say before discussing this that this is a reversion to the policy of Christian state against Jews in the pre-modern periods. Christian states used to employ in their proclamation a very, what they thought then correct, but what is of course very offensive term, Christian blood. If you will read the proclamations of Queen Elizabeth or King Philip II, or even until 18th century, they used to justify their wars and their expedition by including a clause in the orders that they gave to commanders that this war should be done with the lesser possible effusion of Christian blood. This was very common until 18th century. And of course, this meant for them the Jewish blood, of course Muslim blood, Red Indian blood, whatever blood you can add after this, was of no concern. That a war waged, as it is very true, between Christian powers, if you look into history book, had different characters, officially different character, from war waged by a Christian power against a non-Christian power or non-Christian population. Some of the suffering of Jews during all those hundreds of years proceeded from that example. I am saying that we are doing to Palestinians, as my former example and this example show, more or less what Christians and to lesser degree Muslims have done to us. We are of course not the first who have done this. It is quite common that a persecuted group becomes persecutor. We have to inquire how it happens. We have not to close up it, but certainly the expressions used by Rabin and everybody else about freeing of Palestinian prisoners, the open expression about blood, Jewish blood and Christian and Arab blood resemble the expressions used by anti-Semitic regimes against Jews and all the others. But let us go a little further. First of all, let me tell you that because of this ruling criterion, what you hear that Israeli government refuses to free prisoners of Hamas and free prisoners of Fatah is simply not true. Fatah prisoners who happen to wound Jews are not freed because they have Jewish blood on their hands. It is as simply as this. Hamas prisoners, if they signed a simple declaration and they only killed Arabs, are freed. Third, and it is more important than even those considerations, the whole matter of freeing or not freeing prisoners is in realistic terms nonsense, because after Oslo, had they all been freed at once, as Palestinians expected, they could be easily rearrested again. In realistic terms, as many realistic commentators, very far from my opinions otherwise, pointed out, the very best thing that could be done to push the Oslo process at once is to free all the prisoners, or at least 99% of them, 98% of them, and then use them while free as a bargaining power, which was of course never done. But there is something in Israeli policy in cases of taking life in the territories, which continues now for 20 years and more, which is in principle even more shocking and also exhibits, I think, the true character of Israeli regime more than the cases that I told you so far. It has been recorded very many times, I will say especially by the journalist Daniel Rubinstein, who is in Israeli terms quite a moderate, who, although I am friendly with him, let us say he's not of my opinion and I'm not of his opinion, but who is very factually accurate. He repeated it again in an article written in Haaretz on 3rd of October, that according to open declarations of Israeli authorities, that for more than 20 years by now, in case of what is called murder not connected with security, meaning the usual murder, let's say, because neighbors are quarreling, because there's family reason, because of any during a robbery, during anything not connected with security of the state of Israel, when the murderers are caught, and by the way, they are easily caught because both in Palestinian and Jewish society, such murderers usually give themselves up. They are duly sentenced to life imprisonment, but in case of Arabs in the territories, they are immediately freed and sent home. The reason in invented commas, being that there is no place for them in prisons, that prisons are so full of security offenders that there is no place there for a murderer who simply murdered his neighbor. Now this official policy means for me not only something which is very deeply shocking, but something that I am arguing for more than 20 years, that the Israeli rule in territories is not to be compared with the usual imperialistic rules. It is not a colonial rule. Of course, it is much worse, but the important thing is that it is different in kind. I don't think that you, at least I didn't find, but I don't think that you will find any colony in the 20th century or any state which has, let's say, neo-colonialist status, in which murderers who are already caught and sentenced are then sent home as a matter of policy. Which is, I think, and let me tell you that in my opinion, after all that I told you about apartheid in the territories, this to me is the most important mark of that apartheid, that even when a murderer is being caught, he is not being officially, as a matter of policy, punished. Let me now, before returning again to the subject of territories, say a few words about my views. From this point, I will tell you not so much facts. Of course, I will quote facts, but it will be mostly my interpretation from where this policy arose. We have here a Jewish state carrying a policy which, if it would have been applied to Jews, of course it would justifiably bring a very great process. And how it come that at the beginning, in the late 60s, great majority of Israeli Jews have supported it. By now there is some opposition, at least to some aspect, but still government which carries it has a majority, and most of the opposition to this government is from the right, which means that they want more of the same. In my opinion, you cannot understand the word Jews and Jewish if you look only on modern Jews, or if what is in many, for many points of view worse, if you read your Bible, rather your Old Testament, and you make then what I call a quantum jump from the age of the Bible, which ended mostly in the 5th century BC, to the 20th or even the 19th century. My book is served to, so to say, to fill this hole, to point out that during that time, Jews existed, they had a culture, they had a religion very different from the biblical Judaism, very different from the religion of majority of the Jews in this country, because Reform and conservative movements arose only in early 19th century. They are very recent in terms of 3,000 years of Jewish history. And I would like to point you some social facts of this period, which I call classical Judaism in my book, as explaining the oppression and the type of oppression we are inflicting now on Palestinians, which is something very similar, as you will hear presently, to what was inflicted on us during, let's say, 2,000 and several hundred years. Let me begin by something that may seem strange to you in modern period, but that until the rise of modern states, let us say France after Revolution, United States, you can add also to some extent, some small extent, the Republic of the Netherlands and Great Britain from late 17th century, no Jew paid his taxes as individual. What has been done by, let's say, any kingdom, republic, caliphate in Islamic countries, I am speaking about Islamic and Christian countries equally, was that the ruler has imposed on the Jews in his country a lump sum in taxation every year, and then that he conferred, or rather ordered, the Jewish communities, usually unified Jewish communities in his country, to pay him this lump sum. And they had the power, of course, to assess every member of their community as they saw fit. And of course, you know, there is no taxation without punishing a taxpayer who doesn't pay his taxes. Taxation without punishment is contradiction in terms. So they, of course, could do this, otherwise they would not have received the money. But on the way, or together with this power of their coercive power to punish the members if they didn't pay taxes, they also had power to punish Jewish members of their communities for all kinds of religious offenses. For example, I am born in Poland. In Poland, during 18th century, we have on this very full records, Jews who didn't, let's say, violate Sabbath by riding a horse, by smoking, by everyone that you conceived, were punished not by money fines, but they were flogged. I should say here, the Jewish punishments always followed the pattern of punishments in the neighboring country. They were not biblical punishments. They were simply adopted from the from societies in which the Jews have lived. And in some cases, because in Poland Jews had really a great autonomy, they could be executed. There is a famous case, not one of many cases, but of several cases, in which in the year 1760, 360 something years ago, 230 years ago, less than 10% of the Jewish history span, a Jew who in the town now called Lwów and formerly Lemberg, who had the temerity of ride a house and smoke his pipe, admittedly on the street on which the chief rabbi of the town lived, was sentenced to death and executed with the approval of royal governor. Therefore, we had a situation for more than 2,000 years in which Judaism in its orthodox form, because I again emphasize that reform and conservative and any other tendencies didn't exist, was forced on Jews by Jewish authorities, and those Jewish authorities, no less than, let us say, authority of Panama or of whatever country you care, of Saudi Arabia or of many other. Saudi Arabia is actually a good example because it's a country which also inflicts punishments for religious offenses, have performed a necessary service for, of course, the rulers and the ruling classes to whom it paid taxes. And because it performed those necessary and good services, it was given power to punish its inhabitants. Members, this time Jewish members. What has happened with the advent of modernity? And I am using the word modernity, not democracy, because the person who actually freed the Jews of most of the European continent from this situation, Emperor Napoleon, was of course far from being any democrat. But he actually, when he conquered Poland, the country in which I was born, he took from the Jews the power to punish other Jews for religious offense. Let me add in passing that he also took from Poles at the same time to the power of deciding that in certain cities Jews will not be allowed to live. In a city where I was born, Warsaw had a privilege from immemorial times from Polish kings of, as is nicely put in Latin, non Judaeus tolerando, not tolerating Jews within the city limits. And it was Napoleon who said that privileges of the past are not important, of course, because of in imperial interest, of course, and who allowed Jews to live in Warsaw for the first time in many centuries that they lived in Poland. Therefore, only from that time, let us say the end of 18th century, beginning of 19th century, Jews had the power to behave not according to rules of Jewish orthodoxy. They have also the power to say things which were not favored, which rabbis didn't approve, because we have also a good record of punishing people for saying forbidden things. And from that time, Jewish tradition, both of other religious denominations like Reform, and of course, and of rebellion against Orthodox Judaism continues. But what I call liberation from outside, meaning that we were liberated by revolutions carried by other peoples, didn't happen in all countries simultaneously, and even when it happened, let's say in Poland, majority of rabbis during the time of Napoleon opposed Napoleon and his liberation, foreseeing very justly that freedom will be bad for orthodoxy. Indeed, it was so. 200 years ago, all Jews were Orthodox. Now only minority are Orthodox. Therefore, the Jews, especially Israeli Jews, are divided, you can say them, to two camps. And I will forsake history, and I will go to last, let's say, 10 years or 12 years in Israel. Into those who say that Jewish tradition is more important than democracy, and of course also more important than state interest as expressed by terms of profit. The Jewish tradition, continuation of Jewish tradition, is more important than state power. Of course, they will say that the unity of the nation supposedly given by, if everybody will follow tradition, will give us also those things. But the present we are torn. So it amounts to saying that the tradition is more important not only than democracy, not only than profit, but also more important than any abstract idea. let us say, idea of equality of citizens before law, which means also equality of citizens before a bad law. And the idea that religious groups should not allow to punish its members, that the punishment will only be in hands of a state, and again I add, also a bad state in modern state insist on this, are strange to the Jewish tradition because of those 2,000 years and more in which the tradition serves a completely different system. Because of this, at present, more than a half, 30 years ago, more than 90% of Israeli Jews, when asked a simple question, is the treatment of Palestinians in the territories undemocratic? Or will such a treatment serve the end of State of Israel as conquering power? Or even, would such conditions serve our permanent occupation of the territories or not? Would say all those questions are not relevant. The relevance is that in the Jewish land, in land of Israel, will continue to be redeemed. And when it is redeemed, it should never go back to be unredeemed. Let me tell you that this in the past, and I believe in such case in the present, it has happened in many states. And for showing you the close similarity between this thinking and thinking which was prevalent under apartheid, I will return to the example of Palestinian colonel, not only colonel, soldier, jailer. There are, Palestinian villages in Israel in which 90% of males have their livelihood from being soldiers, border guards, policemen, and jailers, literally. If you want one name, I will give you one name, I could give you more. A village of Yarka in Western Galilee is such a village. In spite of this, we go and discriminate in such obvious manner such people who serve us, I mean State of Israel loyally. Is it in the benefit of the state? I will answer you by giving you a parallel. During most of the years of apartheid in South Africa, South African regime used black policemen. I believe all those who have interested in South Africa, both in reading about the country and both in seeing the pictures, have seen under a certain year in which there was rebellion was intensified, black policemen flogging and beating and enforcing other rules, other blacks. Nevertheless, I point to you that black policemen who used to beat other blacks were not allowed to live in Johannesburg. They had to be under the rules of apartheid exactly like every other black. They were not given the same privileges which, let us say, the French imperialist system gave to people who learned in Sorbonne and who were good francophones and who in other good French ways served the French interest. And in the same way, I point to you that there is the same thing in Israel. You can say that there is one difference between South African system and Israeli system, which is that the South African apartheid was based on color, while Israeli system is based on religion, and you can convert to Judaism. I will answer to you that in my opinion, as a Jew who in his own way, very critical way, but his own way, is very devoted to Jewish culture and Jewish tradition of 3,000 years. We indeed think that he is more devoted to those traditions in the better sense of the word than all the Orthodox rabbis take together, if you excuse me a little boast. That this makes the matter worse. Why it makes the matter worse? Let us return to the case of Warsaw, for so many hundred years denied in residence to all Jews. Let us add even the city of Paris. You may not know it, but Paris was closed to the Jews until the French Revolution. Only royal agents could obtain permission to stay in Paris, and only for limited amount of time. Paris, until 1789, was up from sometime in Middle Ages, of course, after the expulsion. Expulsion in the 14th century, was completely closed to Jews. Even when Jews were allowed to live in other areas and in France and to move around it. Let us say that there was a Jew, not very faithful to his tradition, maybe more dedicated to making good profits, and he wanted to live in Paris or in Warsaw. There was a way open to him, conversion. If he went to a priest, and of course in this case to Catholic priest, in other cases to a Protestant minister, and if he converted, at the moment of his conversion, he could live in Paris and Warsaw. In Poland, actually, through all the time of Polish Commonwealth, meaning to the year 1795, a Jewish convert automatically became a noble. So he had more privileges, of course, than even a burgher of the city, and of course more privileges than a peasant, simply because of conversion. What I am telling you, that the situation in the territories is exactly the same. Let us not speak of Palestinians. Let us speak now about American citizens. Let us suppose that that American citizen XY travels in the West Bank and fancies that he will like to settle in a spot, let us say, for a sabbatical. And let us fancy at the same time that I want for a year to cease to do what I am doing, and I want to take a rest among the snows of Alaska. Alaska happens to be 99% owned by the federal government of the United States. If federal official in Alaska will tell me, you, Israel Shahak, cannot rent this piece of land, after, of course, obtaining visa and everything, legal immigrant, I mean, or legal temporary resident, I mean, of course, this will be discrimination. This will be anti-Semitism. I don't have to tell you that many organizations in this country, even if it would be possible, will defend me. But if American will say the same thing about those, not 70, 54% of area of West Bank which stand empty but devoted to Jews, then the official policy of the State of Israel is not to allow him unless he will convert. Unless he will do the same thing as Jews who, for whatever reason, because they were also sincere conversion, did before the modern period, and then they were allowed benefit denied to Jews themselves. So here you have in mind, because of the case of conversion, because of this exception to the rule, you have, it really shows how we Jews, and I mean first of all Israeli Jews, because we bear on this point, on this single point, I want a little to disagree with Noam Chomsky, that whatever the American responsibility, which I of course don't deny, the first and full responsibility of what is done in territories falls on us, Israeli Jews, because we accepted the American funding in the first place, so it makes us the fully responsible agent in this case. And we are, by imbibing, by internalizing the values of our oppressors, this is my view, are now doing to others what was done to us. I am, of course, parodying the text, but this is exactly my intention of doing. There is, in my opinion, only one way out of this impasse, and I have shown you that the peace process, which is based on apartheid, will never therefore succeed, because Israel will not even push it in the ways which are opposing the ideology which is followed by its rulers and by majority of citizens. Of course, there is a way, if the world situation will change, if you will change the policy of the United States, we will follow automatically. But I am pleased to say that in many respects a change was initiated in Israel, maybe not regard with Palestinians, on this I don't want you to have any delusions. 85% of Israeli Jews oppose formation of Palestinian state under any conditions. Even if it will be a state, if I like, of course, I like sometimes to tease my opponents, so I sometimes ask them, if you, would you agree to Palestinian state only in the truncated Gaza Strip and to negotiate about the rest? The answer is always no or silence, meaning sovereignty is denied in all areas or in any single area, but the opinions are changed about democracy and modernity, or about democracy and tradition in other areas. You see, one of the parts of the tragedy of Palestinians is that for us Israeli Jews, they are foreign affairs. And every society is not very much interested in foreign affairs, it is interested in domestic affairs. 3.5 months ago, the Israeli Knesset passed a law in which the import to Israel of non-kosher meat was totally prohibited. This affair caused much more interest and much more discussion than many crucial things concerning Palestinians, because it counted as a domestic affair. But this affair and many other affairs have shown that the forces of tradition are not as strong now as they were strong 30 or 40 and for sure 50 years ago. And therefore, there is a possibility, maybe not a strong one, that by establishing or not establishing strength, enforcing the first principles of democracy at home in the State of Israel, we can also change to some extent, but significant extent, our foreign policies, in this case, our policies towards the Palestinians, which I try to show you are ideologically based. In this situation, I think that Americans have, a part of changing their policy of their country, two roles to play. The first role is to see what we are doing and what we are, and in other words, to obtain accurate information about Israel and Israeli Jews. In this respect, one thing is very crucial. To distinguish between Israeli Jew, whatever are his opinion, and the opinion of the so-called supporters of Israel in the United States. There is a crucial difference which I will try to explain. Let us say that I am arguing now with supporters of Likud, or with supporters of parties who are worse than Likud. Likud is actually not the worst, as I do very often and all the time and quite openly. And I will of course say to him in the course of argument, your policies are leading to war, and in this war many people, including many Israeli Jews, will be killed. He will say yes, but I am taking the risk of my policies. But if he will tell me, even when my standing was much more difficult than now, your policies are leading to war, my first answer will be, yes, and I am taking the risk of my opinion. I am here with you, and if the war will come, I can be hurt, or at that time, after, or until a few years ago, I could even say that I will serve in the army, that I will take the risk of my opinion. The supporters of Israel, and especially the Jewish supporters of Israel, who are here, are not taking the risk of their opinion. If there will be a war because of the policies they advocate, they will at most weep before their TV sets. What is more, if they are really supporters, let us say, of right-wing Zionism, they should, by their own principles, settle now the so-called Judea and Samaria. The fact that they are here causes them guilt feelings, and they are compensating for their guilt feeling by very much greater fanaticism than is present among the great majority of Israeli Jews. Therefore, it is your duty, I think, of whatever are your opinions of Israel, not to be fooled by the supporters of Israel in this country, but go to the source. Even when you support Israel, ask what Israeli Jews of various opinions are thinking, and only after this form your opinion. The supporters of Israel in this country are, for these very good reasons, not telling the truth, even on the matter, even on the most basic matters. The second thing, I think that you will help democracy, you will help the right of Palestinians, you will help also the right of justice all over the world. You see, we would not have been helping butchering the Guatemalans, as Noam Chomsky mentioned, if you were not thinking about Guatemalan bloods, what I quoted to you about Arab blood. The uniting factors of the factor uniting Guatemalans and Arabs is that for Jews who are following the Jewish tradition of what I call classical Judaism, that they are both non-Jews. And Israeli policy in territories and Guatemala and many other countries are therefore essentially the same. If we will become, which I hope we will, a country in which democracy, or if not democracy, some pre-democratic modern principles will win, we will be in a position to change also our foreign policies. Therefore, I hope that after informing yourself about situation, meaning what there is in this aspect, what? First of all, what Palestinians are suffering. I must recall at the end that my main purpose of the speech was to alert you that Palestinians are in territories are suffering, and their suffering is increasing. But after this, I am also requesting you that after learning about situation, you will support also those forces within Israeli Jewish community who are in favor of democracy, who are putting democracy above Jewish tradition. Thank you very much.
What effect do you think Russia's raising
Yes.
will have, since many of them are secular and some of them are believed to not be Jews, on the sort of state ideology of Israel?
Yes, first of all, it did have a great effect. Only the emigration has ceased about 2 years ago. The emigration, by the way, to add to comment of Noam Chomsky, the 2 billion of guarantees are actually now sitting in a Swiss bank and bearing 7%. Because the emigration has stopped. But it is very true that the emigration has caused two effects. One, that most of those people are secular, and it is very true that some of them are not Jews, and some of them are now living a religious life in Greek Orthodox Church. Yes, there are now two churches in Israel who call themselves Jewish Christian churches. One is the Greek Orthodox, it's another Catholic church who say Mass in Hebrew and regard themselves as Jewish Catholics, but I don't know what the ideology and government will do with this. But there is another factor which they cost. They are very poor by now, because Mr. Rabin happens to be the prime minister who is the most devoted to the economic ideas of Mr. Reagan, more than I would say Mr. Shamir before him, and more before any other prime minister. Let me just point in substantiation of the fact that during 2 years and few months that Mr. Rabin is prime minister, the average price of housing in Israel rose by 56%. Imagine such a thing happening in... because of this, you have a conflict between their secularity and their being abjectly, to great extent, abjectly poor. The long-term effect, I think, will be that they will very strongly, the long-term effect, I have to add other factor, and their, I think, great devotion to basic democracy, not to all democracy, basic democracy caused by the revulsion of the form of the Soviet regime, will certainly be that they will support, that they will be against tradition and more for democracy.
It's been requested that the questions be paraphrased or...
Very well, I will
paraphrase.
Very well.
I have, I guess, a two-part question.
To me?
Yes.
Please.
One is that you've described the Orthodox tradition in a Jewish tradition, but certainly there are many others. There's a diversity in Jewish traditions, so that while one may be dominant at one time, there are many other traditions that go on as well. Not just Jewish traditions, but radical traditions that, for example, European Jews carry, and which certainly must exist in Israel. But the other part of the question is this, maybe the more important one is, maybe we could talk a little bit about that. But the most important thing, I think, is that from a practical point of view, running an apartheid state creates a tremendous drain on the people who are in power. And as Professor Chomsky pointed out, there's no dominating reason from, for example, the American point of view why the Palestinians shouldn't be productive in their own way in the world system that's come about. They don't have to be pouring Gaza to fit into that framework. So is it a hopeful situation from that sense?
Yeah. Yes, I think... yes. The first question was, there is certainly Orthodox tradition, but there is a diversity of modern radical traditions existing in East Europe. And it is true, and should I discuss it, it's true, this is an omission of my part. And the second, running an apartheid state creates a drain on people who are running that state. And I suppose it will be for further development of idea that it will be in Israel's interest not to run an apartheid state, even if it wants to govern the territories. You are right about my omitting the radical and traditions of Eastern Europe. This was because of the demand of time. I jumped from orthodoxy, which I said was universal, ruling the Jewish people until about 200 years ago, and I omitted the revolt against, I said about something about reform and conservative, but I omitted the fact that certainly many, there was a Jewish working class movement, there were many parties, there was a the whole literature created in Yiddish and in Hebrew in Eastern Europe is rebellious literature. Some of its greatest creations are utterly rebellious. It still continues in Israel and gives also to people like me part of their strength. I omitted it because all this was not possible in Orthodox Judaism before liberation of outside, and because those who are putting Jewish tradition above democracy are also against this part of modern Jewish tradition. They are, to give you only American example or something conflicting between America and Israel, the famous play Fiddler on the Roof has been really, in my opinion, falsified from a wonderful book of Shalom Aleichem, a wonderful writer in Yiddish whose work are faithfully translated into Hebrew and which are known by every lover really of Jewish culture and of both literature. If you go to most Jewish libraries or general libraries in this country, you will not find a Shalom Aleichem, a writer whose books were literally once published in millions, in many millions, because he's very critical about Jewish tradition. Because in the novel from which Fiddler of the Roof was made, he makes fun and satirizes the Jewish tradition, while Fiddler of the Roof is a song of praise to tradition. So you see, it is true I omitted, I pointed to this, but I thank for the question, and certainly we are in a continuation of this tradition, but in the form of which it was replanted in Palestine, this critical and radical tradition carried a flaw. A flaw meaning that the idea of Jewish rule, Jewish full possession, I should say, not rule, ownership of Jews, of all the Jewish nation of land of Israel, was taken by the first settlers and by Zionist movement straight from tradition, jumping over all those radical and very positive tendencies. Here I can find the best explanation in one of our jokes, because we Israeli Jews continue the radical tradition of the Jewish joking. Maybe, and the joke, very famous in Israel, may be considered, I don't know what, self-hating or anti-Semitic here in the United States, but nevertheless, all Israeli Jews, or most of them, know the joke, that there are some Jews who don't believe that God exists, but who still believe that God gave to the Jews the ownership over the land of Israel. So this will explain to you that some secular Jews could secularize the parts of the Jewish tradition and religion and use them for very good secular benefit. It always reminds me of that saying which was of Voltaire, that when he asked whether he wants his servants to be of his religious opinions, he said, no, all my servants must be faithful Catholics, because otherwise they will steal from me. So here you have something, I think, which is very similar. Now, about the second, it is true to conduct apartheid state is a drain. It is a drain which is, I think, becoming greater, because so many Israeli Jews are traveling to other countries, especially in the last 10 years, and are coming with the sense of observing what they have seen. Nevertheless, it continues. It is now to some extent shaken in domestic affairs. It is a drain which on the other part has a satisfaction in the totalitarian mental attitude peculiar of a true believer. A true believer which believes in all this. It's like in case, of course, of Christian true believers, Muslim true believers, Buddhist true believers, every communistic true believers in the same way, has the sense that he has all the answers from the past. Wise men of the past have decided what is correct. I simply have to follow. I have my own interpreter. I am very much afraid that this feeling of happiness and certainty can compensate for the drain.
In this case, a short statement, but you're more than welcome to respond. As much as I dislike and disagree with a lot of the statements you made about Israel, I think there is a half-truth or completely non-truth. I accept your understanding statement because you are an Israeli citizen. However, as somebody who is not a member of the Jewish religion, at least not a religious organization, or follows the Jewish belief, I do not think you have the right to do this vilification of the Jewish religion. And I don't think his opinion should be taken with more credit. I do not think those opinions can be taken with more credit than the opinion of members of Operation Rescue on doctors who perform abortion. Thank you.
Thank you.
I will point that the first critiques of Christianity and of its treatment of Jews were Christians. And the opinion now set would, if logically followed, that, let us say, Voltaire, who quoted now in advertent, that his critique of Christianity should not be translated to Arabic and published, let us say, in Egypt, because of the same principle. If the principle that the person who made the statement is intended to be universal, I have with him a disagreement. But if he will say that while critique of Judaism should not be made in Israel, but critique of Islam, where Islam, I think, is much more denigrated here than Judaism, and much less power should be, then I have a much deeper disagreement with him, and everyone should choose the view that he prefers. Please.
Yeah, but Voltaire wrote for Christians in France, and that's not what we're doing.
No, I said about Egyptian who is telling the Egyptians about Voltaire's opinion of Christianity, while Christians in Egypt are a minority. And maybe a minority not in such a good condition. And what is more, I am saying this because lack of criticism of Judaism is causing the oppression of Palestinians. It's one of the most important causes of oppression of Palestinians, which without United States support will not proceed very much. Please.
Professor Shahak, I'd like to turn to the issue of what's been going on since Oslo. Another issue about which very little attention is paid over here is the matter of land confiscation and settlements. I think many people in this room probably think that there was a settlement freeze to get the loan guarantees. Now, I'd like you just to say something, if you would, about the distinction which Prime Minister Abiy drew between political and security settlements. How is that distinction playing out, if at all? And what is going on in the case of Hebron since the massacre last February by Baruch Goldstein? I believe that Palestinians have paid very heavily for that massacre in Hebron area. And I'd like your opinion on what can be done in Kiryat Arba, those settlements, the whole Gush Elohim movement. What does the future look like to you?
Yes, the question was what is happening after Oslo, particularly in terms of land confiscation. What is the fate of settlement, whether it increases or not increases, and what the settlers are doing in Kiryat Arba and otherwise. There are more land confiscation. Land confiscation is going on after Oslo all the time as well. In fact, it's increasing. I didn't mention it because I think that if the amount of land confiscated will increase from 70 to 71% or 72%, it will not be a great difference. I think that the fate of empty lands is much more significant. I am, of course, very aware of the suffering of persons of whose land was confiscated, but I think that the most important problem is to see this, in general terms, and in terms of apartheid. Additional confiscation of land are additions to apartheid, and it so should be put. The important fact is that apartheid exists. Now about the settlements. Actually, there was a limitation over settlements, and it was due to Mr. Bush. A few months after attaining power in September 1992, Rabin visited Bush, and they came to an agreement in which agreement which Rabin accepted only after some strong pressure from Bush, that the settlements will be divided, that first of all, no further settlement will be established. This was a great concession, maybe not important in apartheid terms, but under Shamir and Sharon, of course, many settlements, maybe not effectual, maybe not this, but every new settlements were established all the time. From that time, the settlements are divided into two parts, political and non-political. In the so-called non-political settlements, as agreed between Bush and Rabin, settling goes on between as settlement expands, but no new is being built. And in the other category, Israeli government ceased to give the enormous support that it gave formerly. It does give quite a lot of money, but I think that most of that money in the year after Oslo is being spent on demonstrating against Israeli government itself, as fully documented by Hebrew press, and not on the settling purposes. About Kiryat Arba and the settlers and what has been done now, I will say in general terms that the situation in Hebron has not become better, and that I can refer you to a long article about this, which those of you who receive my translations, whether directly or through from my publication here in the United States, can read it for themselves. But I will also tell you that the oppression of settlers in Hebron and Kiryat Arba are a minor part of oppression carried by Israeli army. That we should not remember that the main work of oppression is carried by army and by Israeli soldiers and reservists, and of course by the civilian authorities of the state, the civilian administration and so on. It is the state that oppresses. It is true that the state is using the settlers, especially around Hebron and Kiryat Arba, in additional oppression. And on this I will only answer the question in one respect, which will, excuse me for being selfish, emphasize the point that I made about the rule of law. At the beginning of this year, in January, there was a discussion in Israeli media, in radio, press, and television, what Israeli army can do when a settler from Kiryat Arba points his gun at a Palestinian with intention, possible intention, to shoot at him. A colonel from Israeli army, stationed actually a deputy commander of brigade stationed in Hebron, appeared on Israeli TV. His words were then reproduced by Hebrew press, and said, if I will witness such incident, the only thing that I can do is to run as quickly as I can and to shield the Palestinian with my body, because the standing orders of the Israeli army prohibit me from doing anything else, prohibit me, let us say, from disarm the settler before he he fired. After he fired and wounded, he can be disarmed, but not before this. This is, of course, I really don't need to emphasize that in case of a Palestinian shooting at anyone, of course, the directions are quite different. This will show you how the rule of law, even in the most basic sense, doesn't exist in territories officially. After the Shamgar Committee report, which condemned this order and asked that it will be abolished, practically nothing was done. Not so much because settlers are powerful, but because this order is one of the outward signs of the apartheid. Please.
George Orwell once noted that omission is the most potent form of the lie. I'm just curious that you and Mr. Chomsky are especially fond of quoting Voltaire. Time and again, in the lectures where you cover Noam and Mr. Shahak, you quoted me with Lynn. The first question is, have you ever quoted Voltaire on the subject of Jews? Quote, "You will not find them, the Jews, anything but an ignorant and barbarous people who have for a long time combined with sordid avarice with the most detestable superstition. One should not, however, burn them." You might include that in your repertoire. The second question is, tonight you've dispersed a lot of facts in this room. Palestinian wells, soldier incidents, and your own first-hand observations. As emblematic, I mean, there's no way to footnote these today, obviously speaking, but emblematic of your veracity and your accuracy, could you please comment on the 1960s incident in which you claim that you were a witness to an Orthodox Jew refusing to allow the telephone to be used to call an ambulance for a non-Jewish person that was his home there? And isn't it true that when pressed by Haaretz and other people, you admitted that it was a fabrication of yours? And if it wasn't a fabrication of yours, please be so very specific tonight to tell us the name of the Orthodox Jew and the town in which it occurred. Thank you.
I will begin with the second part of the question. This is about the incident I actually mentioned in the book that I witnessed myself in 1965 in Jerusalem, in Katamon, in the street called Yoash Street, very near a yeshiva there and very near my house. That a religious Jew, as known to me, by the way, since it was my own neighborhood, refused to use his telephone. Telephones were then relatively rare in the neighborhood, in order to call an ambulance for saving this. Then I will go about Voltaire and the Jews.
His name, please. His name.
One moment.
You didn't answer the question.
I am in the middle of answering the question.
What is his name? What is his name? What is his name?
What is his name?
I am.
What is his name?
What is his name?
After witnessing.
He heard the question.
I am answering in my own name, and I am not used, especially in Israel, to submit to Jewish Nazis. Now, I didn't publish this after witnessing the incident. I went first to the Rabbinical Court of Jerusalem. I obtained from the Rabbinical Court of Jerusalem a statement that a Jew should not violate Sabbath in order to save non-Jewish life. With this statement, I went to Haaretz, not with the incident. And I made scandal not about the incident, but about a statement of Rabbinical Court of Jerusalem signed by 3 rabbis. This was the scandal. It is not true. Immanuel Jakobowicz, which somebody quote here, is a well-known liar. And because of this, he was chosen by Margaret Thatcher as her great supporter. Because this, he was made a lord. And I would say to you that if you look into his book, Jewish Medical Ethics, not into his text, but into his biography, you will find in the bibliography articles in Hebrew which don't appear in the text, which say again and again, with literature again being brought in the Hebrew press, in Hebrew literature, and by the way, by professors in Bar-Ilan University, that a religious, meaning Orthodox Jew, should not violate Sabbath in order to save a non-Jewish life, except when it is for the benefit of Jews or for averting a danger of them.
You didn't answer the question.
Yes, and I will not. And I will not. Yes, I answered the question
It will not go away. The question will not go away.
And you're being now, and very well, the question will not go away, and you practically agreeing that Jews will not save Jewish life. You now not saying anything about the statement of the Rabbinical Court of Jerusalem will also not go away. Both things will not go away. Now I will also answer about Voltaire.
What is his name first? Voltaire.
I will also, because I don't want to answer the questions of a Nazi.
What's your name?
And by the way, if in saying about the name, why the cowards who published this about Noam Chomsky and Israel Shahak didn't put any name to this? If they are speaking of, if they are so much about the name, why you will not find here any name or address, a phone to which one can refer?
I wrote that. My name is John Haber, by the way.
And what is your... Now about Voltaire. It is true that Voltaire made many offensive statements about many groups, including the poor, as I quoted. It is true that Voltaire had generalized about the Jews in offensive matter. It is also true that not only he didn't want them not to be burned, but he fought against any discrimination of them, and that he opposed any case of injustice to them. Voltaire is also abused Christian religion and Protestant religion, especially in the most atrocious way. But when there was a case of a Protestant named Calas, he protested against his execution in the greatest way of which he was capable. I will therefore say about Voltaire and about every great man that we have to put his expression of, first of all, we have to see how much he hated a special group. There is a very great difference between a hating special group, so that one should not, let us say, allow the use of telephone or other instrument on Sabbath in order to save them. And there is a very great difference between only abusing that group. I am afraid that abusers of human groups will exist in every society. What I demand, I didn't speak to you one word about those who are worshipping Goldstein. I didn't speak to you one word, but now in answer to Voltaire I will, about rabbis right now who are justifying Goldstein murders and more than Goldstein murder. My answer to quotation about Voltaire will be another quotation which you can read actually in your library because it's from Jerusalem Post, 7th of October of this year, 1994. And it concerns about a rabbi called Ido Elba, who was so racist that he was even indicted by the Israeli authorities. Quote, according to the indictment, Rabbi Elba circulated a 14-page halachic pamphlet entitled Clarification of the Halachot, religious rules, pertaining to the murder of Gentiles. According to Kiryat Arba sources, this pamphlet was circulated after Baruch Goldstein killed 29 Arabs in the Machpelah cave. In the summary of the back page headline for the study but not for practice, Elba allegedly wrote that the biblical injunction, thou shalt not kill, is not applicable to a Jew who killed a Gentile, and this is not forbidden according to the Torah. Elba also wrote that there is a mitzvah, a good deed, to kill Gentiles who are devoted to religions that deny the fundamentals of Jewish faith and the eternity of the Torah, and who, like missionaries and Muslims who believe in jihad, believe that they are commanded to persuade others to join their religion. This mitzvah, good deed, Elba wrote, is applicable when Jews have in their power to do this and when they do not have to fear from the rest of the world. End of quotation. I will first emphasize I didn't say one word about this in my presentation because I emphasize to you that the most important things are done by the power of the state with the full consent of the citizens. In the same way, it is not the incident that I witnessed. The answer is I didn't ask the name of the person, but the ruling of rabbinical court represented by state, which is important.
Now, whether the way Jewish law works is that precise statements in the Bible only refer to specific cases. There are many, many cases of Jews killing Jews that it does not pertain to the statements in the Bible do not kill. And it is strictly prohibited also according to many sources. You have to save lives on Shabbat. There is a problem. There are many problems with violating the prohibitions of Shabbat pertaining to saving anyone's lives. But in the end, the result of many debates is that you must save the person's life. And I don't know which sources you're choosing to quote here, but that is what I have learned from many, many places.
Well, I will here answer that your statement is strictly untrue. In cases of danger to Jewish life, all means should be done, including violation of Shabbat, to save Jewish life. And if you want an argument, you can buy my book. You can, you can offer it to rabbis and let the rabbis answer it. Yes. But I still know that after you asked me a question after I quoted you one single rabbi. You didn't say that you oppose him. You didn't say, after I quoted now something shocking in the name of rabbi who is indicted by the state of Israel itself. You could open your statement that whatever other rabbis say, you oppose this rabbi. You didn't do it. All right, very well. Then the Christians who support Inquisition can use your argument too.
Okay, well, being Jewish, I'll preface my statement that I think that rabbi's comment is repugnant. But going on, I have a comment, not a question. Dr. Shahak,
your presentation, I use that term fairly loosely, is to me a cesspool of misinformation and distortions. I have two comments against this backdrop. First, to the audience, please do not take what he's saying at face value. Go out, research the topic, go to the library, see if reality corroborates what this guy is saying, and let the facts be my witness. This guy speaks the truth about as often as Halley's Comet visits Earth. More importantly, I have this to say to you, sir. Being Jewish, when you use personal pronouns such as we and us, when you talk about the Jewish people, I have a visceral reaction. I say to you what Prime Minister Rabin said to Baruch Goldstein after the heinous massacre in Hebron, and that is, we spit you out with every bit of power we have. Thank you.
I will certainly agree with the first part of the statement. Go on and research. Make your own research and see. Very well. I will point out that although Rabin made this statement about Baruch Goldstein, he didn't make this statement about the many rabbis and other religious figures who supported Baruch Goldstein. And in either case, in any case, I am against spitting out any member from any nation on authority of Prime Minister or President. But if you want to spit me out from Judaism that you represent, then the feeling is mutual. Please.
I'd like to preface my question first with a statement that I am an Orthodox Jew and I disagree with the rabbis that you have quoted. Now, to get to my question, I would like to say that I think you have an inaccurate assessment of what apartheid is. Apartheid, as I believe, is a system of persecution of a racial or ethnic group. In Israel, there is no apartheid. There are over 100,000 Arab citizens of Israel with voting rights who receive services from the taxes they pay. There are also Arabs who serve in the parliament.
Why don't you ask them?
Now, you can say that the treatment of the Arabs who live in the territory is bad, considered unjust. But I think what you're doing by calling that an apartheid state, and there are Arabs who do have rights in Israel, is doing a service to those who fought against apartheid in South Africa. Just as I think when you're calling someone in the back row and yelling out something, you call that person a Nazi, I think you're doing a service to 6 million Jews who were killed by Nazis.
You are lucky. You survived. 6 million people didn't.
Well, the fact that Arabs, by the way, many more than 100,000, the number of Arabs in Israel is about 850,000, have voting rights and many other rights, and they sit in parliament, is very true, doesn't change the situation that a colonel in Israeli army, as I said again and again, who of course has a voting right, cannot use 70% of the land of West Bank. I emphasized, even in this one respect, that in the Israeli army there are very many Palestinians who reach quite high positions. But since you began with this, I am saying something more about it. Which means that although I will not call State of Israel proper, I will apartheid, but I will say that it has some apartheid elements. The word apartheid in full sense should be reserved for the conquered territories. Now why? Because, let us say, the people who serve in the army. About a year and a half ago, when President Ezer Weizmann was elected, he wanted to nominate Druze to be a Druze colonel, a retired colonel, to be one of his officials in his presidential mansion. The authorities, in the sense the secret police, objected on the ground that every non-Jew, whatever the rank in the army, is suspect to some extent. President by Israeli law has access to all secrets and all information. After some argument in which President tried to persuade the secret police, he accepted their argument and the man was not nominated. Which means that the border of apartheid or aspects of apartheid are much lighter, but they are there. If the same argument would be employed in the United States, then Henry Kissinger could not become Secretary of State. Therefore, the situation, even in Israel itself, is more close to South Africa than to the United States. By this differentiation on about religion, about this. Now I will point to you that there are many discriminations in Israel, lighter than in South Africa or the territories, but conversion, religious conversion, will abolish them all. Because of this, I think that one can use about Israel this statement about aspects of apartheid or something else, and that fully applies in the territories. Now about my use of the term Nazi. This was invented by one of my friends and teacher, General Leibovich, many years ago, who used the term Judeo-Nazis very often, and it referred to the fact of denial of common humanity. In this, not only to Baruch Goldstein and such an act, common humanity means to denial of basic facts which even colonial regime is granting, or which came to pass during the invasion of Lebanon, or during the Israeli support to Guatemala and many things. I think that the fact that Jews have lost 6 million during the Holocaust, I am myself Holocaust survivor and have seen it all, doesn't prevent Jewish from becoming Nazis. Nazis became Nazis because Nazi ideology and not because they were Germans. Actually, there were Nazis of many nationalities as well. Jews can become Nazis, in my opinion. I may be right or wrong, but in my opinion, the opinion of very many people in Israel headed by Professor Leibovich, some Jews did become Nazis.
Well, if you're defining Nazis, someone who denies the truth, then you can call lots of people Nazis in this world.
I
have to agree with you, although I make that same comment to the late Professor Leibovich.
All right, so this is the difference in definition, that is all. At least I will point that the term Jewish Nazis or Judeo-Nazis is very much in common in Israel, where I live most of my time, than it is used than here. Please.
Sweeping generalizations about Jewish position and its role in Israeli politics. Now, undeniably, the vast majority of Israelis do not keep the Jewish position at all. And I was wondering how the Jewish position play out if the vast majority of people in the Knesset and in the land itself do not keep the position. And my second point is, I do keep the Jewish position. I'm part of the minority of Orthodox Jews that have remained and will continue to remain. And I have learned about Jewish tradition quite extensively, and I value my Jewish tradition. And I feel that Jewish tradition values life and equality. And I'll give you an example of an ambulance Jewish volunteer service that has New York. It's called Hasala. And they run an ambulance service, and they answer absolutely every call without asking whether the person is a Jew or non-Jew every day of the week. And I just wanted to make that clear that the fact of the matter is that piece of paper that you might have does not play out in reality. The fact of the matter is that the Jewish tradition does value the life of every single person in this world.
The first part the first part of the question, which I will try to answer at some length, yes, I am paraphrasing now, is about Jewish tradition and how Jewish tradition can influence the Israeli politics, although a proportion, I will explain what, a high proportion, as the question is said, of the Jews in Israel are not religious or not Orthodox. And the second example, that the questioner who said that she's Orthodox brought an example of a group which, of a Jewish ambulance service called Hatzalah, which I, of course, highly value, which runs an ambulance service in New York and answers to every call. I will answer the second question first. Much as I value Hatzalah, I have to point to you that the daily situation in Israel is different. For example, not only that ambulance of the settlement center of Ofra, in many recorded cases, is not running on Shabbat, in very famous case in which a wall collapsed in over an Arab cafe in East Jerusalem. The ordinary Magen David, Red Star of David ambulances arrived at once. This was a shocking case of, and this ambulance waited for a few hours. Therefore, I am following the Israeli examples, which are well documented. I am very happy to learn that Orthodox of New York are better, as you quoted. This is, if it is security problems, meaning Jews of New York feeling themselves weak and Jews in Israel feeling themselves strong, it may not be in your favor. I hope that on this point that you are right in a deeper sense, that some Orthodox rabbis about whom I never heard arose in New York and changed the ruling, which I took from the standard text and from the Israeli practice of the last years. If so, I would be very happy to learn about them. Now about the first part of your question. It is true that all polls are showing that that Israeli Jews are divided into three major groups. One is Orthodox, one is called traditionalist, in Hebrew Mesorati, I will explain, and one is secular. We can have various polls, but the usual opinion is that they are 20% Orthodox, 40% secular, and 40% traditionalist, and 40% secular. Now, traditionalists are people who keep very many of Jewish Orthodox traditions, but who violate it also in other ways. The standard Israeli expression, or again a joke, is that those are people who are keeping kosher homes. This obviously will be a requirement. Then going to synagogue every Saturday morning, and then afternoon going to see our sports playing, which are played our afternoon. In politics, traditionalists will be for laws based on tradition. It was, I will not enter into party manipulation due to this law by which import of non-kosher meat was prohibited by the Knesset, but in electoral sense, all the people of traditional persuasion and some seculars too have supported it, because they said, if I want to eat non-kosher meat, I can do it abroad when I'm traveling abroad. Another version it says I can do it in a restaurant, but never in my home. But some coercion must be in interest of Jewish tradition. Therefore, it is not only Orthodox. I didn't attribute the power of tradition to the Orthodox, but to the people generally, as I now explain in detail, who, while maybe violating some laws of Jewish tradition, nevertheless uphold it. In the same way, I have very many people who will break many Christian commandments, will still apply Christian tradition or religion to the question of abortion. Please.
I have a comment and a question to your comment. My comment is that I absolutely agree with what you said at the end of the talk, saying that you are taking the position that you are taking, but you are taking the risk of your policy. And then you went on saying, you know, religious Orthodox Jews in the United States, this is
No religious Jews, organized Jews.
whatever. And this is also true in Europe countries. And then you went on saying they have no right to take any position because they will not take the risk of their policy, and they will just whip in front of the TV set. I just want to add to that you went on after that to ask here this bunch of wealthy Americans that are sitting just here to support your view. And they are not taking the risk of their policy because they won't even whip it from their TV set. They will just laugh or complete indifference to whatever would happen to you, not even to Israel or just to you. They would not care less. And my other comment, my question is the question is more probably to Professor Chomsky is to go away from the problem of tradition, and it's more economic related. I don't understand why you are so critical about the fact that the United States is pouring money to Israel. We can discuss the objective of the United States doing so and the advantage of the policy to do so. But you have to remember that after the war, they also poured money all over Europe. Plan Marshall is there. And now, in the territory, Arafat, even Palestinians are absolutely begging, asking for European community for money. And I think it's wonderful that money would pour there, because economic development is the only way to have peace in this region. It's not by philosophical argument, it's just economy. Everything linked and boiled down to economy. If you have economy stability, you will have peace. So I would just want your answer on that.
Yes, I will answer first. I think you misunderstood me. I didn't say that organized Jews are actually said Israeli supporters, because this applies as much, let's say, to Pat Robertson and to Jerry Falwell as it applies to any Jew, have no right to express their opinion or to support Israel. I said that I advised you not to depend on their views, because their support of Israel makes them compensate, and therefore their opinion tends to be, in my opinion, very inaccurate and not by long experience. But I certainly didn't deny their rights now to express any opinion and forever. I will expect, however, that the opinions of, let's say, of a person who will not weep about what is happening in Israel, to be more dependable on the average, who will weigh the situation in Israel and Middle East and Palestine equally, to be more dependable than the person who will weep over what's happening, but still not go over there and carry his conviction. My point was about his conviction. I think that an Israeli right-winger in Kiryat Arba, I may oppose him as very strongly, but I will not deny, some of the things that I will not deny him is that he fully carries out his convictions. Those who are supporting the Kiryat Arba, let's say the supporters of Goldstein in New York, are not doing the same thing like the supporter of Goldstein in Kiryat Arba. They are only giving money, and because of this, I found that even with the most extreme, let's say, Kahanist in Israel, you can carry a sort of argument, limited in extent, than with the same Kahanist in New York, or when he is visiting Israel for a short time. And the same thing applies to every category, meaning you can a Likud supporter in Israel is, in my view, a much more interesting and valuable person to discuss than the person who supports the same view in the United States, and so on and on through spectrum. And I advise you to go to the source. Now, I ask your permission to say something about money, before American money, before you will elaborate on this. You see, American money, in my opinion, going to Israel has two great faults, which are not dependent on the point that I made and that Noam Chomsky made, that it is also used for indirectly for settlements, for all kinds of aggressive politics. First of all, American money is only spent on the army. The so-called economic aid is not spent on Israeli economy. I mentioned that guarantees have not been used. The economic aid is spent on to repay the debts of our acquiring weapons. What it means? It means that Israeli army is supported about half and half by taxpayer money and half by money coming from United States, which means in turn that the government is, in this very important respect, not dependent fully on the taxpayers, and it is more powerful than it should be. Second, it means something that we in Israel are calling militarization of Israeli society and economy, which means simply that many people, not at all of my opinion, are considering that the army is now too great for the Israeli security means. The sign of this overgrowth is that by now, in the last budget, from the Israeli taxpayer money, if we take only the half spent by Israel, 58% of the Israeli army budget is spent on salaries and pensions, while in 1967 the corresponding figure is 1961, which means that in addition to everything, it is my opinion and opinion of people who are not in the same opinion about Palestinians, that actually American support may make the Israeli army larger, but it is quite a question when it make it stronger. Please.
With respect to Professor Shahak, who's had a long day and just flew in this morning, we'd like to end the program as close to 10 as we can. And it's 10 right now. So,
let me take another question, because after the announcement it is all right. Please raise your voice. I don't hear.
Something that Professor Chomsky mentioned about factories in parts of the
It is on purpose that I quoted discrimination done to Israeli colonels and of course other soldiers, and to point up that discrimination is done to people who fought in Israeli wars, and that are still discriminated, and therefore, or people who oppress other Palestinians are still discriminated, and because of this, you cannot really explain, in my opinion, or if you can, I don't accept your argument, that discrimination is done for reasons of security. There are quite enough cases in which the reason actually increases in security. If a Palestinian soldier, and the number of Palestinian soldiers who serve in Israeli army is increasing. By the way, this is due to Likud. It was the Likud defense minister Moshe Arens who opened the Israeli army in 1990 to volunteers of all religion. It was the Labour government which until that time prohibited Muslims, except Druses and Bedouins, to serve in the army. So you can count it as a sign of progress, but even after this, people who serve in the Israeli army are discriminated, therefore it cannot be security. Then Israeli wars. Obviously, last Israeli war, the invasion of Lebanon, was purely a war of aggression and was not motivated by any security. In the same way, I will say that the War of Suez 56, another example in which Israel allied itself with Britain and France in order to invade Nasser and to topple Egypt and topple Nasser regime, it was done for ideological or maybe also imperialistic reasons, but not done for security. In many other ways, it can be shown that wars, in general, there are exceptions. Of course, I am not speaking about the first war in 47-49, whose causes were complex in many ways, but further Israeli wars had mostly reasons which had not to do with security. I accept your point about hatred. I actually didn't say in my presentation that Israeli Jews hate Palestinians or that the discrimination is inflicted out of hatred. They are, of course, haters, but their number is small, and they don't, and those who, let us say, worship Baruch Goldstein or Rabbi Elba don't influence Israeli policy. I didn't quote them except when answer and after some provocative question, but I think that it is that both in the Jewish case and in the case of all other groups which initiate horrifying policies, let us say in case of Arab states who initiated, most of Arab states which initiated horrifying policies also, but all other states, it was not hatred. It was ideology. Ideology doesn't mean hatred. Ideology, if you will look, let us say, I will now specially take a faraway example, the Inquisitors. We know very much about the Inquisitors. They wrote books and letters, and people wrote about them. I think no serious scholar will say that the Inquisitors were moved to burn people alive by hatred. They considered that the good of religion and also the good of society consists in so harming a minority for the great benefit of the rest. And I am also saying to you that those people who is my end of my presentation, support Jewish tradition over democracy and therefore discrimination, are in the main not motivated by hatred, are motivated by the same reasons, which is usually not hatred, which motivated other regimes and other groups to discriminate against other groups because they believed, they truly believed in a bad ideology that they adopted. And I will say further that in most of the cases, ideological oppression which caused in so many cases, I mentioned Inquisition, the adoption of a system of regime of which Inquisition was a part, ruined Spain, which was before this a very flourishing country. Adoption of ideology which then initiated a bad policies, of course first brings harms of the enormous harm and suffering of the oppressor. But I try to show, and now in answer to your question I will be explicit, that in my opinion adoption of this ideology and of this discrimination will also bring calamity on us. I mean, you may differ, of course, from this estimate, but this is at least my opinion.
The ideology isn't an ideology of desiring to cause harm to others.
Yes, you are right. The ideology of Inquisition in case of many heretics was to bring the heretic to paradise. And if not this heretic, by this example of saving others from paradise. I say it with full understanding, also of course with full enmity. The bad ideologies in most cases are not designed to cause harm, I agree. But they still are bad and cause suffering and discrimination. 20% of land denied to Palestinians, and ask yourself what is happening to them. Then the answer will be that 16% has been given to the settlers, to the Jewish settlers. Again, I emphasize Jewish settlers, not Israeli settlers. But 54% of the land stands empty. It was not distributed, it was confiscated, it stands empty. I can flatter myself that for very many years I formed very many friendships among Palestinians of the West Bank and many others. And I would say, and my opinion is supported by many other Israeli Jews, not necessarily those of my opinion, that had the Israeli government, after Oslo, taken those 54%, more than half, empty lands of the West Bank, empty, I mean emptied, of course they were not empty before, or let us now take plainly, half of the area of the West Bank which was robbed of its rightful Palestinian owners, but it was not given to anyone else. And giving it back to the Palestinian farmers, the Oslo process could be pushed for quite a number of years. With all its consequences, I am now not entering the consequences. I fully agree with Noam Chomsky about the consequences, and I know also that Israeli government considers that the Oslo process is very much for benefit, but the ideology of not giving back the land, which, as I point in my book, was already redeemed meaning being given to Jews as possession of the Jewish state, giving it back to non-Jews, in this case Palestinians, and causing the land therefore to become unredeemed again, was more important than every political consideration, let us say that every counting of profits. Let me say something about Palestinian side in this business. Palestinians everywhere, but especially in the West Bank, are using an Arabic word, sumut. Sumut means attachment. By this they are expressing, I think very justly, in a slogan, their attachment to the land. Because if you look through the years what has happened to the Palestinians in Palestine, you see that they have been driven east. And what they desire, in my view, of course, which can be disputed or contested, but in my view, based on my very many Palestinian friends, is that the process will not only stop, but at least to symbolic or extensive sense reversed, meaning that after a process in which always Palestinian lands were being taken over and never returned, even if some of you know about the Israeli village Baram and Ikrit, I am mentioning you, is used only for benefit of Jews. Let me get it very accurate. When you read in your media about Israeli settlements, this is not correct. They are not intended for all Israeli citizens, of whom 17% are Palestinians actually. Let me add at this point that there are Israeli Palestinians who serve in the army, in fact in increasing numbers. There are Israeli Palestinians who, let us say, reached in the army the rank of colonel. Some of them were even governors, or usually deputy governors, of West Bank and Gaza Strip district. But the important point is that an Israeli colonel who is not Jewish cannot benefit from 70% of the area of West Bank and from the 30% area of the Gaza Strip. But the important fact, of course, is not the Israeli colonel. This is illustration. Important fact is that the first thing, in my opinion, that you should know about Palestinians and their feelings in the territories and also out of the territories, because the land is also denied to Palestinians in diaspora, that a Palestinian from the West Bank sees 70% of the land, of his land, on which is not only confiscated from him, but on which he cannot do anything. He cannot rent it, he cannot, either apartment or a piece, he cannot do with it everything, while the land is open to officially and legally to all the Jews. Before going to the implication of the word all the Jews in this respect, let me give you some additional figure, or additional set of figures. You know, being natural scientist, I cannot escape from feeding people with numbers. I said right now that 30% of the Gaza Strip, the 30% which was left under Israeli ownership, all belongs to the State of Israel. The number of the people on that 30% is 6,000. The number of the people of the remaining 70% is 800,000. This by itself I call apartheid. The situation in Gaza Strip before, and of course in the West Bank too, before Oslo and after Oslo is a situation of apartheid. I could add many other details that majority of Gazan water is given to the 6,000 settlers on the 30% of the area, that there is a nice pleasure lake in one of those areas, while water in the rest of Gaza Strip is nearly bring harms to health. It is on the border of bringing harm to health. But I will go to something much more significant in the West Bank. If you take those 7 permits to dig 1,000 wells, let us say chosen by their, let's say, by their willingness to support peace process, but 1,000 Palestinian farmers. This would have be of enormous effect not only of those 1,000 farmers, but let us say on their cousins and second cousins, practically on all the farmers, because just in the case of land, and especially empty land, this would have shown that the process of not allowing development for one side and allowing it on other would be reversed. Now, apart, you can imagine there are very many other discriminations, or shall I say manifestation of apartheid in the territories. But therefore I will limit myself and speak about one more before going more deeply to analyzing the situation in general terms of apartheid and its roots in its ideological roots, meaning from where this ideology arose, at least in my view. The additional factor that I want to discuss is so-called rule of law. First of all, contrary to most of the states of the world, whatever they are otherwise, and contrary to the state of Israel itself, the system of law in West Bank and Gaza Strip is not territorial. What it means, it is not territorial. Let us take the so-called state of Panama. I am not now discussing how it serves the United States interest. I think I am agreed with it with Noam Chomsky. But I would want to point to you a fact which is different in Panama and in the territories. Let us say an American tourist goes to Panama City and commits a traffic offense. Let us say he is driving wildly or drunkenly. Of course, the Panama police will arrest him. Of course, he will be put before Panaman court. And I think that the United States in such cases will not protest. At least it didn't protest now. But in territories, there is no territorial law, therefore, like in Panama or even like Grenada. Israeli Jews, especially settlers, but all Israeli Jews, if they will commit an offense in the territories, including traffic offense, will be brought to Israel and will be judged within Israel by Israeli civilian courts. Not, by the way, by the Israeli military courts, which are judging Palestinians for any offense. Meaning that even though the courts in territories are Israeli and military, in order to show the superiority of one group over another, the Israeli military courts in territories have till this very day not judged. Thank you very much. Although I will indeed try to introduce some material from my book, I will mostly devote my presentation to questions of human rights and how they affect the Israeli policies, simply because I always consider that with all my passion for various kinds of scholarship, that human rights and alleviating human suffering have to come first. The general subject of my presentation will indeed have to do with fundamentalists, but not what a fundamentalist group, in this case Jewish, is doing by itself, but how fundamentalistic thinking and theories are affecting the practices, the theories and practices of the State of Israel and the territories. Of course, in Israel too, but I will omit that from the consideration for this time. And how actually this ideology, which is strictly followed by the secular state for various reasons, is making the peace process, the Oslo-Cairo peace process, which is actually very profitable to Israel, and which is everything that Noam Chomsky has said it is, into by now something very unrealistic. Meaning that there are, if a state is enslaved more to ideology than to profit, it cannot serve profit. You know, there is that great saying, you cannot serve God and Mammon. Maybe instead of God we should substitute other things in this connection, but certainly you cannot serve racist ideology, as I will immediately show, and conduct realistic policies in, let us say, which will bring investors to the area. I will begin with problem of land. First of all, as it came to exist after 27 years of occupation, and as it continued after Oslo, meaning in the last 14 months. At the time that Oslo agreements were signed, September 1993, about 70% of the West Bank and about 30% of the Gaza Strip came into possession, into ownership of the State of Israel. I will not discuss here for lack of time how they came into possession of State of Israel, just as I will not discuss how much of most of federal land in the United States became federal land. The most important thing for me is to say that officially, not socially, but officially, land which belongs to State of Israel is just in passing, that a Maronite village in Israel called Baram, whose actually people of whose in part helped Israel invade Lebanon because they are Maronites, still they have its land not returned against all precedent and all benefit. If therefore those empty lands, contrary to existing settlements in which, as let's say half realist, I admit, there would have been what is called trouble, opposition, demonstration, and so on. There is always trouble in carrying justice when the robber already has something in his possession. But I am emphasizing here something which would not have carried trouble except ideological trouble. And this didn't happen. The second point, meaning that the apartheid ideology, as I am calling it for more than 20 years, is more important than other considerations, and it is this ideology, application of this ideology, of course, much more visible to Palestinians there than to people here, quite in addition, of course, to the deceptions of American media, which more and more convinced by now, ended by convincing Palestinian people that peace process is not peace for them, not for any farmer, not for any poor man, maybe for some rich people, but for nobody else besides. Let me take another point, water. I am afraid that Israelis and Palestine are not similar in their climate to Massachusetts. They are more similar to Arizona and New Mexico, meaning that water is the crucial factor in agriculture and development of agriculture. The very first thing that Israel did in the territories in September '67 was to impose a regulation, or two regulations really, one prohibiting Palestinians to drill or dig wells on their own private property. Let me get it clear, on the 30% of West Bank which still belongs to Palestinians, they are forbidden totally and completely to dig wells from September '67. And in the existing wells, whose capacity was measured at the time, they are prohibited to install new pumps with greater capacity. Of course, the settlers are not prohibited to do this, with the result that, according to my last data, which are admittedly about 4 years old, the 130,000 settlers on the West Bank are used more water for agriculture than 1.5 million of Palestinians. First of all, I call it apartheid again. Secondly, I will tell you that if after Oslo, Israeli government would give 1,000, let us say, chosen Palestinian farmers